Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to Watson's Margins. Edward here, your companion for another unhurried evening of reason and reflection. Tell me, is there a book nearby? Perhaps a cup grown gently cool beside you, the lamp doing its quiet work against the dark? These are the hours Watson valued most deeply, when the ink had dried, the day had withdrawn, and the mind, freed from its restless errands, could finally begin to see clearly. If these evenings of careful thought bring you comfort, do subscribe to Watson's Margins and join us whenever stillness calls. Now, settle in, for as one great observer of the human condition understood, it is only when we truly look that the world consents to reveal itself. You'll find the Watson's Margins Spotify channel linked in the description below. We'd be glad of your company there. Chapter 1. The Solicitor of Impeccable Reputation. It is a curious feature of my long association with Mr. Sherlock Holmes that the most consequential of our investigations have frequently announced themselves in the most unassuming of fashions. A folded note upon the breakfast table, a telegram delivered between the second and third cup of tea, or, as was the case in the affair I am about to set before the reader, a letter of such studied formality that Holmes declared its author's anxieties evident before he had so much as broken the seal. It was in the latter days of October, when London had drawn its grey autumnal cloak about itself, and the gas lamps along Baker Street burned with a peculiar amber warmth against the encroaching dusk, that Holmes summoned me from my armchair with that abrupt and characteristically undeferential manner which I had long since ceased to resent. "Watson," said he, holding the letter aloft between two fingers as though weighing it upon an invisible scale, "we are invited to Lincoln's Inn Fields tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock. A Mr. Alistair Pembroke, solicitor, requests our counsel upon a matter which he describes as almost certainly trivial, yet which has caused him, he admits in his final paragraph, 3 successive nights of disrupted sleep. A man who loses 3 nights' sleep over a trivial matter, my dear fellow, has already decided the matter is anything but." I set aside the journal I had been reading and crossed to where Holmes stood by the window, the fog-diffused light of the street lending his angular features an unusually contemplative cast. He passed the letter to me without further comment. Mr. Alistair Pembroke wrote in a hand that was precise and deliberate, each letter formed with the care of a man accustomed to documents upon which considerable sums depend. He was, as Holmes had indicated, a solicitor of some standing, his chambers situated in that most venerable quarter of the legal profession, and he wrote to consult Holmes regarding what he termed an anonymous campaign of correspondence directed against his late client's estate. The language was measured, even understated, yet beneath its professional surface I could detect, as Holmes had detected before me, the unmistakable tremor of a man in genuine distress. His late client, I observed. A matter of inheritance, then? Almost certainly, and one of some antiquity, if I am any judge of a man who describes the affair as rooted in documents dating back several decades. We shall go, Watson. I confess the problem presents certain features which are, at the very least, suggestive. The following morning found us in a hansom, rattling eastward through streets still damp from an overnight rain, the pavements gleaming dully beneath a sky of unrelieved pewter. Lincoln's Inn Fields presented, as ever, its aspect of sober professional dignity, its Georgian facades as impervious to the modern city's clamour as the law itself endeavours to be. We were shown without delay into the private office of Mr. Alistair Pembroke, and it is that room, and the man who occupied it, which first lodged in my memory as the starting point of so singular an investigation. Pembroke was a man of perhaps 60 years, tall and spare in the manner of one who has kept himself in careful order throughout a long and disciplined life. His silver hair was brushed back from a broad, intelligent forehead, and his eyes, grey and attentive beneath heavy brows, were the eyes of a man accustomed to hearing what others prefer not to say aloud. He rose to receive us with a composed courtesy, gestured us to 2 leather chairs arranged before his desk, and resumed his own seat with the deliberate economy of movement that suggested, to my medical eye, that the 3 disturbed nights had taken rather more from him than he would willingly acknowledge. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson, I am grateful for your promptness," he began, his voice steady and well modulated. I must be candid with you from the outset. I am not entirely certain that I have done correctly in consulting you at all. The matter may prove, upon examination, to be precisely what it appears, a vexatious nuisance and nothing more. And yet you did consult me, Holmes replied pleasantly, his grey eyes travelling with practised swiftness about the room before settling upon our host. Pray proceed, Mr. Pembroke. I shall form my own opinion as to the matter's gravity. Pembroke folded his hands upon the desk before him and proceeded to lay out his account with the ordered precision of a man who is, above all things, a professional. His late client, Sir Julian Harbury, had died some 18 months previously, leaving behind him a considerable estate in the county of Hampshire, the bulk of which was secured by a legal charter drawn up some 30 years earlier, following the death of Sir Julian's elder brother, Godfrey. This charter had established, beyond apparent question, Sir Julian's sole right to the inheritance, and for 3 decades it had served its purpose without challenge. Since Sir Julian's death, however, anonymous letters had begun to arrive at Pembroke's chambers, 5 in all, each written in a different hand and posted from different districts of London, all suggesting, with varying degrees of boldness, that the charter was not what it appeared to be. "Forgeries, Mr. Pembroke?" Holmes inquired very quietly. For the first time I observed a fault in the solicitor's composure. It was slight, the merest tightening about the mouth, a fractional pause before he answered. But Holmes, I knew, would have noted it with the same precision with which an astronomer notes the transit of a distant body. "That word has not been used in these letters," Pembroke said. "They are studiedly vague. They speak of irregularities, of questions that were never put, of parties who were not given the consideration they were owed. I have treated them as the productions of a malicious mind, Mr. Holmes. And yet—" He reached into the upper drawer of his desk and produced a small bundle of letters, which he passed across to Holmes. My companion spread them upon the desk before him, examining each in turn with swift and silent attention. "You mentioned in your letter to me that there are individuals connected to the Harbury estate," Holmes said presently without looking up. "I should like to know who they are." Pembroke listed them with admirable concision. There was Miss Eleanor Harbury, Sir Julian's niece and sole surviving relative, who had inherited the estate subject to certain provisions and now resided at Harbury House, the family's Hampshire property. There was Mr. Cedric Mallory, a gentleman of independent means who had enjoyed a close friendship with Sir Julian for many years and continued to visit the house regularly. There was Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, who had served the family for upwards of 2 decades. And there was Mr. Finch, the estate archivist, a meticulous and somewhat reclusive individual who had been engaged by Sir Julian some 15 years earlier to organise and preserve the family's considerable accumulation of historical documents. Holmes listened to this recital with his eyes half closed. "And do any of these persons know of the anonymous letters?" Pembroke hesitated. "I have been careful to say nothing, but Harbury House is a place where very little remains private for long. It is possible that something has reached them." "Possible," Holmes repeated, and I caught in his tone that particular note of quiet emphasis which told me that he considered the matter a great deal more than possible. He rose with his customary abruptness, the letters in his hand. "You have told me, Mr. Pembroke, that the charter secured Sir Julian's inheritance following the death of his brother. I take it that the brother died without issue." "He did. The death was sudden, a riding accident as I understand it, and Godfrey Harbury had made no formal testamentary provision. The charter gave legal form to what was described as the natural and uncontested disposition of the estate to the surviving brother." "Uncontested," Holmes murmured, and set the letters down upon the desk. "And yet, 30 years later, 5 separate correspondents see fit to contest it. Curious. Very curious indeed." He turned to me. "Watson, I think we ought to visit Harbury House." As we descended to the street, I asked Holmes what he had made of Pembroke himself. Holmes was silent for a moment, buttoning his coat against the chill. "A man of genuine rectitude," he said at last, "who has lived for 30 years in the comfortable certainty that a document is sound, and who has recently begun, for the first time, to examine that certainty." Note, Watson, that he described the charter's origin entirely in terms of what he had been told, never once in terms of what he personally had verified. There is a difference, and he knows it now, though I suspect he has known it only lately. He paused upon the pavement, glancing up at the grey October sky. The question that interests me is not who wrote those letters, it is what the letters were intended to prevent, or to provoke. I had no satisfactory answer to offer him, and Holmes, characteristically, did not wait for one. He raised his hand for a cab, and we moved on into the autumn morning, the great city flowing past us, indifferent to the first small shadows of a mystery whose depths I could not yet begin to measure. Chapter 2. The Gathering at Harbury House. The Southern Counties Express deposited us at Whitchurch Station on a Thursday afternoon of such relentless dreariness that the very countryside seemed to have taken on the character of a watercolour left too long in the rain. A trap had been arranged by Pembroke, who had telegraphed ahead, and the driver, a taciturn Hampshire man with the deeply seamed complexion of one who has spent a lifetime in open weather, conveyed us along narrow lanes between hedgerows stripped nearly bare by the advancing season. Holmes sat beside me in a silence which I had learned, over many years, to distinguish from mere quietness. It was the silence of a man whose attention is wholly outward, cataloguing what he sees with the disciplined appetite of a naturalist in unfamiliar country. Harbury House announced itself first as a series of chimneys above a low rise, and then, as our lane curved to approach it directly, as the whole of its austere and rather melancholy self. It was a substantial building of the early Georgian period, constructed in a grey limestone that the years had darkened still further, its proportions correct, and its general effect deeply, almost aggressively, unornamental. The lawns before it had been maintained with a care that argued professional attention, but the gardens at the house's eastern flank had grown somewhat wild, and the great cedar which dominated the southern aspect cast, even on a colourless afternoon, a shadow that seemed to precede the twilight by an hour. It was not, I reflected as we descended from the trap, a house that invited easy spirits. We were received at the door by Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, and it is worth recording my first impression of her with some care, since she was to occupy so considerable a place in the events that followed. She was a woman of perhaps 55, solidly built, with a composed and watchful face in which the only remarkable feature was a pair of very steady dark eyes that assessed us, I thought, rather more than a housekeeper's welcome strictly required. Her manner was entirely correct, measured civility, no more and no less, and she led us through a wide hall hung with the portraits of several generations of Harburys to a drawing-room where the other members of the household had gathered before an adequate fire. Miss Eleanor Harbury rose to meet us, and I was immediately struck by the contradiction between her outward composure and some quality beneath it which I can only describe as a tightly governed unease. She was a woman of perhaps 30, fine-featured and dark-eyed, with the kind of self-possession that derives less from confidence than from long practice in concealment. She welcomed us with a directness which I found admirable, thanked Holmes for making the journey, and said, without any of the social circumlocutions one might have expected, that she hoped the matter would be resolved with minimal disturbance to those who had already endured sufficient uncertainty. Beside her stood Mr. Cedric Mallory, who was introduced as a family friend of long standing. He was a broad-shouldered man in his late 40s, with a ruddy, somewhat florid complexion, and the heartily genial manner of someone who has discovered that geniality smooths the path considerably in most social situations. He shook Holmes's hand with vigorous warmth, and mine with equal enthusiasm, and made several pleasantries about the weather and the journey, which, though perfectly well judged in form, had about them a quality of deployment, as though they served a defensive purpose he preferred not to make visible. Mr. Finch, the archivist, was the last to present himself, emerging from the direction of what I later learned was the estate library, with an ink stain on his right index finger and an air of distracted precision. He was a small, dry, careful man of 60 or thereabouts, thin in the face and slow in his movements, with spectacles worn low upon a sharp nose, and a habit, which I observed throughout the evening, of pausing before he answered any question, as though he were consulting some internal index before committing himself to a reply. Dinner was served at 7, and it was at the table that the atmosphere of the house made itself most fully felt. The dining room was handsome but cold, the fire set on that side of the house apparently insufficient against the October draughts, and the candlelight, while flattering to the silverware, gave the faces of those around the table a quality that was at once intimate and obscuring. Conversation moved, as it does in company that is assembled under unusual circumstances, along carefully maintained channels, each participant seemingly alert to where the current might carry them if their vigilance slackened. Holmes was, as he invariably is on such occasions, deceptively unremarkable. He ate sparingly, spoke pleasantly upon general subjects, and gave no outward indication of the attention he was paying to everything around him. I have observed this performance many times, and yet it retains its capacity to mislead me. Only afterwards, when he would set out precisely what he had seen and why it signified, would I understand that the amiable dinner companion had in fact been working with the concentrated precision of a watchmaker throughout. The charter was introduced into conversation, I believe by Mallory, though the manner of its introduction was so apparently casual that it might almost have been accidental, when the topic of the estate's history arose over the fish course. Mallory remarked upon some renovation that Sir Julian had undertaken in his later years, and this led, by what seemed a natural enough progression, to a general observation about the estate's long continuity in the family. It was at the word continuity that I noticed Finch's fork pause, fractionally, above his plate. Miss Harbury lifted her wine-glass with a deliberateness that just exceeded the natural, and Mrs. Dalrymple, who had entered at that moment to supervise the removal of a dish, stood for perhaps 2 seconds longer near the sideboard than the task required. Holmes, I was certain, had seen everything I had seen, and a great deal more besides. He said nothing, and it was precisely his nothing that interested me. He allowed Mallory's conversational gambit to pass without engagement, asked instead about the history of the cedar on the south lawn, and the moment slid away. But the reactions had occurred, and no subsequent course of conversation could undo them. After dinner, the party separated, with what I felt was a measure of relief. Finch retreated to his library. Mallory proposed a hand of cards, with an enthusiasm that found no takers. Miss Harbury excused herself with the quiet authority of a woman who has learned to manage her own household on her own terms, and Holmes and I were left with a decanter of reasonable claret before a fire that had finally been persuaded to draw properly. I was about to speak when Holmes raised a hand. "Not yet, Watson. Let the house settle. In my experience, country houses have ears proportional to the number of uncomfortable secrets they contain, and this one is listening to us rather attentively." He stretched his legs towards the fire and studied the flames with the meditative ease that I knew, by now, to be entirely manufactured. "Tell me what you observed at dinner." I offered my account, and Holmes listened without interrupting, which was itself a compliment of sorts. When I had finished, he nodded once. "You have seen it well. The reactions were real, and they were uniform in one respect. Each was a reaction of a person who carries existing knowledge of the Charter's history, not of someone merely surprised to hear the subject raised. Surprise and anxiety are entirely different things, Watson, and I saw not one atom of surprise at that table tonight." He paused, turning his glass slowly in his fingers. "What I find most instructive, however, is what I did not see. Not one of them looked at another when the word was spoken. When people share guilty knowledge, they look away from one another with a consistency that is almost as revealing as looking directly. These people have lived with their separate awareness for a long time. They have learned, each of them, not to acknowledge it." "Each of them," I said. "You mean the guilt is distributed?" "I mean," Holmes said carefully, setting down his glass, "that the anxiety most certainly is. As for the guilt, that, Watson, is a rather more particular question, and one I am not yet in a position to answer. But I intend to be in a position to answer it before we leave this house." He rose then, and crossed to the window, drawing back the curtain to look out at the dark and silent lawn, where the cedar stood in vast and invisible patience against the night sky. "Tomorrow," he said, more to himself than to me, "I should like a considerable conversation with Mr. Finch." Chapter 3. The Death in the Study. I slept badly that night. The room assigned to me was comfortable enough in its appointments, but the house itself seemed to conduct sounds along its corridors and walls with an unsettling fidelity. The creak of old timber settling against the cold, the distant complaint of a shutter insufficiently latched, and once, some time past 2 in the morning, What I was nearly certain were footsteps on the landing outside my door, deliberate and then abruptly stilled. I lay awake, listening for their resumption, heard nothing further, and eventually arrived at a thin and unsatisfying sleep, from which I was roused, shortly after 6, by Holmes standing at my bedside fully dressed and regarding me with an expression in which urgency and something approaching satisfaction were curiously blended. "Pembroke," he said, before I had spoken a word, "you had better come at once." I dressed in haste and followed him along the corridor to the wing of the house where Pembroke had been given a guest room, adjoining the small private study he had been using to review the estate papers. Holmes had already preceded me through the study door, and it was there, slumped in the chair before the writing desk, that we found Alistair Pembroke. He was quite dead. A glass that had contained brandy stood at his right hand, his own hand resting beside it, with the open laxity of a man who has simply ceased. His face was turned slightly away from the door, towards the cold grate, and his expression, I made myself examine it with the detachment my profession demands, was neither contorted nor peaceful, but rather blank, as though whatever final thought had occupied him had been of no particular consequence. Mrs. Dalrymple stood in the doorway behind us, composed to a degree which, given the circumstances, I found more remarkable than any display of distress would have been. "I came to lay the fire," she said. "At 5:30, as every morning. I did not touch anything." Holmes did not reply to her. He was already moving about the room with that swift, almost dancing precision of movement which transformed him, on such occasions, into something quite unlike the languid figure of Baker Street. He examined the body without touching it, bent low over the writing desk, crossed to the grate, straightened and studied the window latch, and then stood for a long moment in the centre of the room, with his chin in his hand, his eyes making that rapid, systematic circuit of the space, which I had long since learned to leave entirely undisturbed. I made my own examination of Pembroke. There were no marks of violence upon him that I could immediately identify. His colour and the general attitude of his body were consistent with a death that had come upon him quickly and without struggle. The brandy glass had contained, I estimated, no more than a modest measure. I noted, without yet being able to assign it significance, that the pen on the desk before him lay uncapped, though there was nothing written on the sheet of paper beneath it, beyond the date and the first 3 words of what might have been a letter. "Suicide?" I said, and immediately felt, from some quality of the silence Holmes maintained, that the question was in some respect already answered. "Consider the pen, Watson," he said, without turning from the grate. "A man who intends to die may write a final note, or he may not. If he intends to write one, he does not leave 3 words and stop, not unless something interrupted him with considerable speed, and if something interrupted him, it was not of his own arrangement." He crouched before the cold grate, produced his lens, and studied the interior with minute attention. Furthermore, a man who has resolved upon his own death does not arrange the scene with such particular care, and then neglect the single detail that would make his intention legible. The absence of a note is not what troubles me. It is the presence of a pen, suggesting a note was contemplated and abandoned mid-execution. I looked again at the desk. The sheet of paper was of good quality, cream-coloured, bearing the Harbury House watermark. The 3 written words were, "I must confess." What followed them was a space of white blankness, and then, at the right margin, a faint mark that might have been made by a finger pressing the page flat. Holmes had moved on to the document that lay to the left of the writing paper, a legal instrument of several pages, held together with a treasury tag, which I recognised as the contested charter. He studied it for some time without lifting it, then straightened with a slow deliberateness that told me he had found what he was looking for, or something very close to it. "The ink," he said quietly, "here and here." He indicated 2 passages in the charter's 3rd paragraph with a finger that stopped just short of the paper. The remainder of the document was written with a consistency of ink and nib throughout. These 2 passages present a subtly different lustre, not wildly different, not the difference between old iron gall and modern commercial ink, but sufficient to indicate that they were added or altered at a different time and with different materials. Someone of considerable skill has worked upon this document. The alterations are not recent. but they have been revisited, Watson, and recently." He pointed to a line near the foot of the page, where I could perceive, though only barely, the ghost of letters beneath the existing text. An erasure, and then a reinscription. The original has been altered twice. Outside in the corridor, the house had begun to stir. I heard Miss Harbury's voice, low and controlled, speaking to someone further along the passage, and the heavier tread that I associated with Mallory descending the main stair. Holmes took one final look about the room, and then turned to Mrs. Dalrymple, who had remained in the doorway throughout, with the stillness of a woman exercising considerable self-command. "When did you last see Mr. Pembroke alive?" he asked her, his tone entirely conversational. "At dinner last evening. I brought coffee to the drawing-room at 9 o'clock. Mr. Pembroke was present." "And after 9? "I retired to my own quarters at 9:30. I have no knowledge of events after that hour." Holmes regarded her for a moment, in which his expression was one of pure, courteous attentiveness. "Thank you, Mrs. Dalrymple. You will, I hope, discourage anyone from entering this room until the police have been sent for." She withdrew. The moment she was beyond the door, I turned to Holmes. "You do not believe her?" "I believe every word she said," he replied, and there was in his voice the faint, dry edge that served him in place of humour. "What she said is not the difficulty. It is the considerable architecture of what she did not say that will repay our attention." He moved to the window and looked down at the frost-whitened lawn below, the cedar still and enormous in the grey morning light. "The household, Watson, is grieving unevenly. Go and observe them for me, would you, while I remain here a little longer? I am particularly interested in Miss Harbury and Mr. Finch, not in what they say to one another or to you, but in what they do with their hands and their eyes in the first minutes after they learn what has happened." I found them assembled, within the quarter hour, in the entrance hall. Miss Harbury, Mallory, and Finch, all three informed by a pale-faced young housemaid who had heard Mrs. Dalrymple's instructions and drawn from them the natural inference. Miss Harbury received the news with a stillness so complete it was nearly geological, one hand rising slowly to rest upon the newel post of the stair, as though she required its support for equilibrium rather than for physical balance. Mallory reacted with an exclamation and a visible reddening of the face, then drew back into the conventional expressions of shocked concern with a haste that suggested he recognised his first response as something he preferred not to have displayed. Finch said nothing at all. His eyes, behind their low, worn spectacles, moved immediately and involuntarily to the door of the east corridor, the corridor that led to Pembroke's study, and rested there for 3 full seconds before he recollected himself and looked away. I noted everything and carried it back to Holmes, who listened with closed eyes and then, opening them, said simply, "Finch knew." "Knew of the death, you mean? Or something more?" Holmes was quiet for a moment that stretched until it became its own kind of answer. "I have sent word to the village constable," he said at last, "and asked that Inspector Lestrade be telegraphed from Whitchurch. This is no longer a matter for quiet inquiry alone." He looked once more at the still figure of Pembroke, at the uncapped pen, at the haunted document on the desk, and his expression, rarely given to sentiment, almost never to pity, contained for just a moment something that was not quite either, but was not entirely unlike both. "The man came here to tell the truth," he said. "Whatever the truth cost him, he very nearly paid it." Chapter 4. Fragments and False Leads. Inspector Lestrade arrived on the afternoon train, accompanied by a sergeant whose name I did not catch, and a small leather bag of the kind that policemen carry when they expect to remain somewhere longer than they would prefer. He came into the entrance hall of Harbury House with the brisk, proprietary air he invariably adopted when stepping onto what he considered his professional ground, shook Holmes's hand with the warmth of a man who has long since made his peace with being consistently outpaced, and announced that he had already formed several preliminary views during the journey down from Waterloo. "Pembroke was poisoned," Holmes said pleasantly, before Lestrade could share them. The inspector's expression underwent the particular rearrangement it always suffered when Holmes arrived at a conclusion before him. "The post-mortem has not yet been conducted," he said. "No, but the brandy glass will be found to contain traces of an alkaloid compound. almost certainly administered in a dose calibrated to act within the hour rather than immediately, which tells us something interesting about the person who administered it, and something rather more interesting about the circumstances under which Pembroke accepted the glass. He knew the person who brought it to him. He had no reason to suspect them, and he was, at the moment it was given, in the midst of writing something that he very much needed to complete. Lestrade looked at me. I offered him a sympathetic inclination of the head, which he received with the stoicism of long practice. The morning had not been idle. While Holmes moved through Pembroke's study with the unhurried thoroughness of an archivist cataloguing a newly discovered collection, I had twice walked the length of the east corridor, attempting to fix in my mind precisely which rooms connected to it, and who might plausibly have been in a position to carry a glass of brandy to Pembroke's door, without being observed at an unreasonable hour. The study itself shared a wall with the estate library, Finch's domain, and was separated from the main guest bedrooms by a baize-covered service door of the kind that large country houses install for the quiet passage of staff. Whoever had brought the brandy had either come from the library side of the corridor or through that service door, and in either case had been obliged to pass a wall-mounted lamp whose wick, Holmes noted, had been turned conspicuously low. The fireplace had yielded two things of interest. The first was a fragment of parchment, perhaps 3 inches by 2, which had not burned fully, and lay among the ash with its edges carbonized, but its centre legible. Holmes had lifted it with a pair of pocket tweezers, and examined it without speaking for nearly a full minute before depositing it with great care in the inner pocket of his coat. The second was a penknife, a small, silver-handled instrument of good quality, which had evidently rolled from the grate's lip and come to rest against the iron fireback. Its blade, when Holmes extended it, showed a faint residue along one edge which he identified, without apparent hesitation, as dried ink of an older formulation than the commercial variety. Someone used this to scrape a surface, he told me, and someone afterward attempted to dispose of it in the fire. The handle did not catch. The ink is not from this decade. The penknife he kept. Over the course of that long grey morning, each member of the household submitted to Holmes's attention in ways they may not have recognised as examination. He asked Miss Harbury about the estate accounts, a question so apparently routine that she answered it in full without visibly registering its purpose, and learned in passing that a review of the family's historical financial records had been commissioned by Pembroke some 4 months earlier, a fact which she mentioned in the tone of someone who had been asked to remember something of no consequence and found the task unexpectedly simple. He inquired of Mallory, with every appearance of idle curiosity, whether he had ever witnessed the charter itself, and Mallory replied that he had seen it once, years ago, in Sir Julian's possession, and that it had appeared perfectly in order, at which point Holmes thanked him with such warm finality that Mallory was clearly left with the impression that the subject was closed. Finch proved considerably more guarded. Holmes visited him in the library that afternoon, and I accompanied him, ostensibly to admire the collection. The room was impressive. Floor-to-ceiling shelves along 3 walls, a pair of reading tables illuminated by good north-facing windows, and at the far end a large plan chest, of the kind used to store flat documents, maps, and architectural drawings. Finch received us at one of the reading tables, with a stack of estate ledgers before him that had the appearance, I thought, of having been arranged specifically to justify his presence in that spot rather than any other. Holmes moved about the room with the unstudied ease of a man who simply finds books naturally attractive. He paused at the plan chest, remarked upon its quality, and asked with perfect mildness whether the family's legal documents were stored within it. The historical documents, yes, Finch said. The current legal papers are kept in Mr. Pembroke's. He stopped. Were kept with Mr. Pembroke, including the charter. I believe Mr. Pembroke brought a copy to the house, yes. The original is deposited with his chambers in London. Holmes turned from the plan chest with a pleasant smile. And the copy we found in Mr. Pembroke's study, was that prepared recently, or had it been with the file for some time? Finch took his characteristic pause before answering, and in that pause Holmes was entirely still, watching him with a patience that appeared effortless, and was, I knew, anything but. I couldn't say, Finch replied at last. I had no occasion to review it. Holmes thanked him and moved on to ask about a volume of county history that happened to be shelved nearby, and the conversation resolved itself into an entirely ordinary discussion of Hampshire antiquities. Yet as we left the library and descended the corridor towards the main hall, Holmes murmured, without slowing his pace or turning his head, "He could say, Watson. He simply chose not to." Lestrade, once installed and briefed upon the physical evidence, produced his preliminary theory over supper with the confidence of a man who has arrived at a solution that fits all the available facts and is not yet aware of the facts it does not fit. Finch, he proposed, was the obvious candidate. As archivist, he had unlimited access to the estate's historical documents and would have possessed both the technical knowledge and the physical means to alter a legal charter. If Pembroke had recently commissioned a review of the financial records, as Miss Harbury had revealed, and if that review had led him to certain questions about the charter's authenticity, he might well have confronted Finch directly. Finch, faced with exposure, had altered the document once more to obscure the evidence, and had silenced Pembroke before he could act. It was a clean and persuasive construction. Lestrade set it out with visible satisfaction, and I confess that as I listened, I could find no immediate flaw in its architecture. The means were established, the opportunity was clear, and the motive, while dependent upon inference at certain points, was coherent. Holmes listened throughout with every expression of attentive respect. When Lestrade had concluded, he said in the measured tone of a man paying an honest compliment, "It is a thoroughly competent account." Lestrade looked gratified. Competence, however, Holmes continued, examining the stem of his wine-glass, is occasionally the precise quality most likely to mislead us. Your theory explains what Finch might have done, and it explains it admirably. What it does not yet explain is why Pembroke's unfinished note reads, "I must confess," rather than "I have discovered," and why the recently re-altered sections of the Charter concern not the transfer of property from Godfrey to Sir Julian, but the identity of the witnesses who were present at its original execution. The silence that followed was the particular kind that descends when a room full of people simultaneously understands that the ground beneath a settled argument has shifted. "The witnesses," I said. "Precisely," said Holmes. He set down his glass and looked for a moment towards the window, beyond which the October night pressed against the glass with absolute opacity. "In a forgery, Watson, the instrument itself tells you what was changed. The witnesses tell you who was in the room." Chapter 5. The Charter's Origin. Holmes spent the better part of that night in the library. I know this because I rose at 2:30, driven by a recurrence of the sleeplessness that had afflicted me the previous night, and saw the thin line of lamplight beneath the library door as I passed along the corridor. I did not disturb him. There are periods in Holmes's investigations when he enters a state of such concentrated internal activity that interruption, however well-intentioned, is a positive injury, and the quality of the silence behind that door, purposeful, inhabited, told me that this was one of them. I returned to my room, and by the time I descended at 8 the following morning, he was already at the breakfast table, apparently refreshed, with a pot of tea, a rack of toast largely untouched, and a small collection of notes arranged before him in the order of a mind that has spent several productive hours in the company of old documents. "I have been through the plan chest," he said, by way of greeting. Finch maintains the archive with admirable system, which is to say that the absence of any record relating to the period immediately surrounding Godfrey Harbury's death is considerably more conspicuous than its presence would have been. I poured my tea and sat down. "Removed, you think? Or never deposited? Either interpretation is interesting." He turned one of his notes towards me. Upon it, in his precise small hand, were 2 columns of dates. The charter itself is dated the 14th of March, 1861. Godfrey Harbury died in January of that year. The instrument that transferred the estate to Sir Julian was therefore executed some 7 weeks after the elder brother's death, which is not in itself irregular. What is irregular is this. He indicated the right-hand column. The Charter employs in its 3rd and 4th clauses a form of words that was introduced into standard legal practice by a revision to conveyancing guidance issued in October of 1863. 2 years, Watson, after the document purports to have been drawn up. I set down my cup. An anachronism. A small one, and one that only a person familiar with the evolution of legal drafting over that period would be likely to identify. I might have overlooked it myself had I not spent 3 hours this winter past assisting a friend at the Inner Temple with a paper on precisely this subject. The forger was skilled enough to reproduce the physical appearance of an 1861 document with considerable fidelity. But language is a more treacherous medium than ink and parchment, and he, or she, reached for the familiar formulation without considering that the familiar was not yet available. Then the charter was forged sometime after 1863. At the earliest, more probably in the mid to late 1860s, when the revised language would have been thoroughly absorbed into common practice, which means the forgery was not an act of immediate opportunism following Godfrey's death. It was planned and executed with deliberation, some years after the fact. He rose and moved to the window, looking out at the grounds where a gardener was making his slow way between the bare rose beds. The question this raises is one of motive. If Sir Julian was in peaceable possession of the estate from January 1861 onwards, if no one contested his inheritance in the immediate aftermath of his brother's death, why fabricate a legal charter to secure it several years later? What had changed that made such a fabrication feel necessary? It was a question I could not answer, but its implications were plain enough even to me. The forgery was not a response to an immediate threat. It was insurance against a future one. Someone, at some point between 1863 and whatever year the document had actually been created, had become aware of a vulnerability in Sir Julian's position. A vulnerability that existed, presumably, in the facts of Godfrey Harbury's death, or in the true disposition of the estate before it. Holmes had already turned from the window and was reaching for his coat. I proposed to spend the morning in Whitchurch. There is a solicitor there who has served this district for 40 years, and before him his father served it for 40 more. If there is any contemporary record of the settlement of Godfrey Harbury's estate, any notation of how the transition of ownership was managed in the weeks following his death, it will be in that office, or in the county record depository to which they deposit their older files. Will you accompany me? I would, and did. The morning was cold and clear, the first genuinely bright day since our arrival, and the Hampshire lanes had a bleached autumnal beauty that I should have appreciated more freely under different circumstances. Holmes was largely silent on the drive, which suited me well enough, and I occupied myself with reading the notes he had made, which proved to be a compressed but thorough survey of the Charter's language, with marginal annotations that indicated where he had cross-referenced it against dated examples drawn from the library's collection of estate papers. The solicitor's office in Whitchurch was presided over by a Mr. Carver, a deliberate and courteous man who received us in a room lined with deed boxes stacked to the ceiling and extending in both directions along the walls in a manner that suggested the accumulated legal anxieties of several generations of Hampshire landowners. He listened to Holmes's inquiry with careful attention, disappeared for some 20 minutes into a rear room from which the sounds of systematic searching could be heard, and returned, bearing a slim folder of papers which he laid before us with the air of a man who has found rather more than he expected. "The Harbury estate settlement of 1861, he said. "My father acted for the family at the time. There are his notes, and a copy of the document as originally submitted." The copy was old, its edges darkened with age, the ink faded to a pale sepia. Holmes examined it for no more than 90 seconds before he sat back in his chair with an expression of settled, almost sombre satisfaction. "As I thought," he said quietly. He did not explain himself to Carver, and on the return journey his account to me was measured and careful, as though he were constructing it aloud in order to test its internal consistency before committing to it fully. The document Carver had produced was a straightforward summary of the estate's transition, brief, functional, and lacking the elaborate formality of the charter we had examined in Pembroke's study. More significantly, it bore 4 witnesses' signatures rather than the 2 which appeared on the contested charter. 2 of those names Holmes recognised from the charter, 2 he did not, and their absence from the later document was, he explained, the clearest possible confirmation of deliberate excision. The original settlement had 4 witnesses, he said, The charter, fabricated some years later, reproduces only 2 of them, presumably because the other 2 presented a difficulty. What kind of difficulty? He was quiet for a moment, watching the hedgerows pass. The kind that arises when a witness knows something that contradicts the document they are being asked to underwrite. One of the 2 absent names I recognise from the household records I reviewed last night. A domestic employee of the Harbury family in 1861. A young woman engaged as a clerk in a purely administrative capacity during the period when the estate's papers were being managed. He paused. Her name, at that time, was Eleanor Marsh. I turned to look at him. He met my gaze with the steady, unsurprised calm of a man who has been walking towards a particular door for some time and has finally reached it. Mrs. Dalrymple, I said. Her name upon her marriage was Dalrymple, Holmes confirmed. She has been with the Harbury family, in one capacity or another, for over 30 years. She was present when Godfrey died. She witnessed, or was party to, the original settlement. And when a forged charter was drawn up years later to secure Sir Julian's position against whatever had emerged to threaten it, her witness signature was quietly omitted, because she knew, better than anyone, what the true record contained. He looked forward along the lane, his voice dropping to a reflective quietness. She has carried that knowledge for 3 decades, Watson. The question is not whether she bore it willingly. The question is what she was prepared to do when she perceived that it was about to be taken from her by force. Chapter 6. A Pact of Silence. We returned to Harbury House in the early afternoon to find that Lestrade had spent the morning interviewing the household in the formal sitting room with the methodical patience that was, in truth, his most reliable professional virtue. He met us in the entrance hall with his notebook open and the expression of a man who has gathered a quantity of material he has not yet been able to arrange to his satisfaction. Finch has been cooperative, he said, to a degree that I find, frankly, suspicious. Miss Harbury has been courteous and almost entirely uninformative. Mallory talks a great deal and says very little, and Mrs. Dalrymple answered every question I put to her with the precision of someone who prepared her answers before I arrived. He looked at Holmes. You have that expression you wear when you know something. I frequently know things, Holmes replied, without particular apology. Walk with us, Lestrade. There are matters I should lay before you, and I prefer to do so outside the hearing of this house. The 3 of us walked the length of the south lawn in the pale October sunshine, the cedar casting its long shadow at a low angle across the frosted grass, and Holmes presented his reconstruction of the charter's origin with the same ordered clarity he had used with me on the return journey from Whitchurch. Lestrade listened without interruption, another of his virtues, and one that Holmes would grudgingly have acknowledged, and by the time the account was complete, we had reached the far boundary of the lawn and stood looking back at the grey and unrevealing facade of the house. Eleanor Marsh, Lestrade said slowly. Mrs. Dalrymple. He turned it over once or twice, testing it. You are certain? The handwriting in the household accounts for the past 20 years matches the signature on the original settlement document. I satisfied myself of that this morning before we left for Whitchurch. The formation of the capital letters is distinctive in a way that time has modified but not erased. Lestrade closed his notebook with a soft, definitive sound. Then she knew the charter was a forgery from the beginning. Not merely knew it, Holmes said. She participated in its creation. Not as its architect. I do not believe she possessed either the legal knowledge or the authority to have conceived and executed the forgery independently. She was, 30 years ago, a young woman in a subordinate position, directed by those above her. But she was present. She handled the documents, and when the forged charter superseded the original settlement, her witness signature was omitted from it, partly to distance her from the instrument, and partly, I suspect, because whoever directed the enterprise understood that a young woman with first-hand knowledge of what the original records actually showed was more safely kept as a confidential ally than installed as a named signatory on a fabricated document. I have been considering this as Holmes spoke, and something in it troubled me. You say she was directed by those above her, I said, but Sir Julian is dead. If he was the architect of the forgery, he cannot be held to account, and Mrs. Dalrymple, as a subordinate participant, might reasonably have hoped the matter would dissolve with him. She might have hoped so, Holmes agreed. For 18 months following Sir Julian's death, I suspect she did hope so. The anonymous letters changed that calculation considerably. We turned and began walking back towards the house. The gardener had disappeared, and the grounds were entirely still, the only movement a wood pigeon making its slow, heavy way across the pale sky above the cedar. "The letters," I said. "You believe she wrote them?" Holmes shook his head, once, with decision. "No, she did not write them. Consider, Watson. If Mrs. Dalrymple wished to suppress knowledge of the forgery, she would be the last person to initiate a correspondence drawing attention to it. The letters came from elsewhere. Someone else knew, or had arrived at a strong suspicion, and chose anonymity as their instrument for reasons of their own." He was silent for a moment. The letters served, whatever their author's intention, as a catalyst. They brought Pembroke back to the Charter. They brought Pembroke to Harbury House. And they brought Pembroke to the point of writing those 3 words, "I must confess," which tell us that he had by then understood what the document was, and understood, moreover, his own role in its recent history. This was new, and I said so. "The Financial Review," Holmes said, "commissioned by Pembroke 4 months ago, as Miss Harbury told us. Why does a solicitor of 30 years' standing, whose late client's estate has been settled without challenge, commission a review of historical financial records? Not from routine diligence, from anxiety. Something had led him to question the foundation upon which that estate rested, and he was, at the last, attempting to discharge the obligations of his profession, however belatedly, and however terrible the personal consequences he anticipated." Lestrade had been following this with close attention. "You believe Pembroke knew the charter was fabricated? Before the anonymous letters, I mean." "I believe he suspected it. I believe he had suspected it for a long time, and had chosen, as decent men sometimes do when the truth is both costly and ambiguous, to manage rather than examine his suspicion. The letters stripped that management from him." Holmes paused at the edge of the lawn, looking up at the house. "There was a pact of silence here, Lestrade. Not a formal arrangement, nothing so precise, but a shared understanding among several people that certain facts were better left undisturbed. Sir Julian at its centre, the beneficiary. Mrs. Dalrymple as participant and keeper of the original record. Pembroke as legal custodian who had, over the years, perhaps arrived at more understanding than was comfortable. And one other, I think, whose identity I am not yet ready to specify, who served as the instrument of the forgery's actual execution." "The person with legal knowledge," I said. "The one who understood the language of conveyancing." "Just so, and who has, for 30 years, relied upon the silence of the others to remain undiscovered." Holmes's voice was, if anything, quieter than usual. "That person is still in this house, Watson, has been in this house throughout. And when the anonymous letters arrived, and the carefully maintained equilibrium began to shift, it was that person, not Mrs. Dalrymple, who felt the ground moving most acutely beneath them." I looked up at the windows of Harbury House, and found myself wondering, not for the first time in my association with Holmes, at the capacity of an ordinary domestic scene, the drawn curtains, the steady smoke from the chimneys, the familiar arrangement of a country house in afternoon, to contain within it a history of such deliberate moral compromise. "There is something else," Holmes said, as we reached the front steps. He spoke without any particular emphasis, in the tone he used when presenting what he considered an established fact. "The fragment of parchment recovered from the study grate. I have been able to read the surviving portion this morning in better light. It is a portion of a letter, not the charter, not an estate document, but a personal letter written in a hand that is neither Pembroke's nor the hand of anyone currently resident at Harbury House. The surviving words are few, but among them are the phrase 'lawful heir' and a partial date, from which I can determine only that the letter was written in the autumn months of a year in the early 1860s. Someone brought that letter to this house, Watson. It had been preserved for 30 years and brought here deliberately, and then someone else destroyed it before it could be read." Lestrade drew a long breath. "The rightful heir," he said. "The outline grows rather dark." "It has been dark from the beginning," Holmes replied, and pushed open the front door. "We are only now acquiring sufficient light to see it clearly." That evening, after supper, Mallory excused himself early, pleading a headache, and I noticed that he was careful, as he rose from the table, not to meet Mrs. Dalrymple's eyes. She, for her part, continued to serve the remaining dishes with her habitual composure. That I observed, as she reached past me to remove a glass, that her hand held a faint, controlled tremor that had not been present at dinner 2 nights before. Holmes noticed it too. I knew because, when the door had closed behind her, he said nothing at all, and his silence had, by then, become a language I was beginning to read. Chapter 7. The Obvious Solution. Lestrade presented his revised theory the following morning at breakfast, and he did so with the measured confidence of a man who has spent the night reorganizing his conclusions and arrived at an arrangement he finds altogether more satisfactory than his previous one. He had, to his credit, absorbed Holmes's reconstruction of the previous afternoon and built upon it with genuine intelligence. The charter, he now accepted, was a forgery of considerable antiquity. Mrs. Dalrymple was connected to that forgery as a subordinate participant. Pembroke had arrived at the house in a state of private crisis, his professional conscience at last overcoming his long-practiced capacity for managed ignorance. These points Lestrade granted freely, and I thought Holmes listened to their recitation with the quiet appreciation of a teacher who observes a capable student mastering yesterday's lesson. What Lestrade proposed, however, was this. Finch, the archivist, had discovered the truth of the Charter's origins through his own systematic work among the estate documents. Recognizing the leverage this gave him, he had begun a private campaign of extortion, not the anonymous letters, which Lestrade now attributed to some more distant party with a grievance, but a personal and direct approach to those within the house who stood to lose most from exposure. When Pembroke arrived and began his own quiet investigation, Finch had perceived that the solicitor would expose him before he could extract sufficient advantage from the situation. He had therefore introduced a substance into Pembroke's brandy, altered the charter once more to muddy the evidential waters, and burned whatever documents threatened to implicate him directly. "The means are established," Lestrade said, spreading his hands upon the table. The plan chest gave him access. His professional expertise gave him the knowledge to make alterations that would pass ordinary scrutiny. The ink residue on the penknife is consistent with his work, and his manner throughout has been that of a man who is managing something rather than reacting to it. He looked to Holmes with the expression of a man extending a reasonable invitation to agreement. Holmes, who had been consuming his toast with every appearance of a person whose mind was engaged elsewhere entirely, set it down and regarded Lestrade with something that was genuinely close to warmth. "It is an admirable theory," he said, "internally consistent, evidentially grounded, and constructed with a logical care that does you real credit." Lestrade's expression acknowledged the compliment, while simultaneously registering a wariness that long experience had taught him was appropriate whenever Holmes praised him in these terms. "However," Holmes continued, with the quietness of a man who considers the word entirely sufficient, "it is too complete." "Too complete," Lestrade repeated. "Consider what your theory requires of Finch. It requires that he identified the Charter's fraudulent origin through archival research, possible, certainly, for a man of his expertise. It requires that he then conceived and executed a program of extortion against multiple parties simultaneously, rather more demanding, for a man whose entire professional character suggests a deep constitutional preference for solitude and system over human confrontation. It requires further that when this program was threatened by Pembroke's arrival, he reacted with sufficient speed, nerve, and practical competence to obtain a poison, administer it in circumstances requiring intimate access to the victim, and subsequently alter a legal document and destroy compromising material, all while maintaining before myself, Watson, yourself, and the entire household the precise demeanour of a man mildly inconvenienced by extraordinary events. Holmes paused. "It is not that any single element is impossible. It is that the complete portrait requires Finch to be simultaneously 3 different kinds of person, and in my experience, human beings are rarely so versatile in their villainy." Lestrade was quiet for a moment, working through this. To his credit, he worked through it honestly. "You think he is protecting someone?" I think he knows rather more than he has said, and that his reticence is not the reticence of guilt, but of complicity of a different and older kind. Holmes pushed back his chair and rose, moving to the window in that restless way he had when a problem was approaching resolution and his mind was running slightly ahead of the evidence still available to him. There is a distinction, Lestrade, between a man who has done something and a man who has watched something being done and said nothing. Finch belongs to the second category. He has been the archivist of this secret as faithfully as he has been the archivist of the estate's documents. What he holds is not evidence of his own actions. It is memory of someone else's. Miss Harbury entered at that moment to inquire whether we required anything further, and the conversation shifted with the practiced fluency of three men who have learned the value of discretion in a house that listens. She was, I thought, paler than she had been the day before, the particular pallor that comes not from illness but from sustained and sleepless anxiety, and there was about her movements a deliberateness, a careful placing of each word and gesture, which suggested a woman navigating by close attention to the ground directly before her feet. When she had withdrawn, Lestrade said in a lower voice, "The young woman stands to benefit considerably if the charter is invalid and the estate is redistributed. I have not overlooked her as a candidate." "Nor should you," Holmes said, without turning from the window. "She has motive, and she is not without intelligence. But motive alone has never hanged anyone, and I observe that Miss Harbury's distress has the quality of a person confronted with an unwanted truth, rather than a person managing the concealment of an action. They are quite different things in the face and the hands, if you know how to look." The morning passed with a surface quiet that I found, by this stage in our stay at Harbury House, more oppressive than any open agitation would have been. I walked the library again while Finch was absent from it, examining the plan chest and the shelving around it, with no clear purpose beyond the vague intention that proximity to the material facts of the case sometimes clarifies what pure reasoning leaves obscure. I found nothing that Holmes had not already noted, but I did observe, tucked behind the lower shelf of a section devoted to Hampshire parish records, a small leather-bound notebook of the personal rather than official variety, the kind a man carries in his coat pocket rather than leaves upon a reading table, which bore no name upon its cover, and which I brought to Holmes upon his return from a private interview with Finch that had lasted the better part of an hour. Holmes examined the notebook with immediate and focused attention. Its pages contained entries in a small, crabbed hand, dates, initials, and beside them brief numerical notations which might have been sums of money, or might have been references to document folios. He went through it twice in complete silence, then looked up. "Whose hand?" I asked. "Not Finch's. His writing I have examined in the estate ledgers. It is precise and upright. This hand belongs to someone who writes in haste, or who has trained themselves to write small from long habit." He turned to the inside front cover, where a single line had been written in a different ink, more recently, in handwriting I recognised as belonging to Finch himself. It read simply, "In the event of my death, deliver to Miss Eleanor Harbury." I absorbed this for a moment. He anticipated that something might happen to him. He has anticipated it, I think, for some considerable time, which tells us a great deal about the person he feared. Holmes closed the notebook and stood. His expression had settled into that particular stillness which, in all our years together, I had come to associate with the final alignment of a picture whose component pieces have at last found their correct positions relative to one another. "Tomorrow, Watson," he said, "I intend to conduct a small experiment. I shall need the cooperation of Lestrade, your own good judgment, and the forbearance of the household for one further evening." "And the notebook?" He weighed it once in his hand. "The notebook tells us what was recorded. What I require now is a means of establishing what is remembered, and by whom." He slipped it into his coat pocket. "The past 30 years have been maintained by silence, and silence can be broken by many instruments. I intend to use the simplest one available." He did not, that evening, elaborate further, but when we took our respective places for dinner, I noticed that Holmes looked once, briefly, and with quiet deliberateness, at each face around the table in succession: Miss Harbury, Mallory, Finch, Mrs. Dalrymple, and that his expression as he completed the circuit was one of settled, patient certainty, the expression of a man who knows the end of a story and is waiting, without particular urgency, for the final pages to turn themselves. Chapter 8. The Quiet Experiment. Holmes was at his most agreeable on the morning of the experiment, which I had long since learned to regard as a reliable signal that he was operating upon a plan whose details he preferred to keep to himself until the precise moment of their deployment. He descended to breakfast in good spirits, made several pleasant observations about the quality of the Hampshire air and the merits of Mrs. Hudson's marmalade by comparison with what had been provided at Harbury House, and engaged Lestrade in a conversation about a celebrated forgery case from the previous decade that was, on the surface, entirely without bearing upon their present circumstances. Lestrade, who had by now sufficient experience of Holmes to know that apparent irrelevance in his company was rarely actual irrelevance, listened with the cautious attention of a man trying to identify which of several shells conceals the significant object. The experiment itself, Holmes had explained to me in the brief interval before we descended, was a simple one. He had prepared 4 separate accounts of the Charter's history, each containing the known facts in their correct arrangement, but with a single variation inserted, a different variation in each version concerning a specific detail of the forgery's execution that could only be known to someone with first-hand involvement in the original event. He would present a different version to each member of the household over the course of the morning, framed as a summary of his current understanding, and invite their response. A person with no direct knowledge of the forgery's mechanics would accept all versions with equal equanimity, or challenge none with any particular authority. A person with first-hand knowledge would correct the variation that contradicted what they themselves had witnessed. "It is a blunt instrument," he acknowledged, buttoning his cuffs with the efficiency of long habit. "But a blunt instrument, precisely applied, serves as well as a sharp one. And if more than one person corrects their version, then I shall have more than one person with first-hand knowledge, and the question of their relative culpability will require further refinement. But I do not expect that outcome." He began with Miss Harbury, to whom he presented his account in the drawing-room shortly after 10 o'clock, while I occupied a chair near the door, on the stated pretext of reading the previous day's newspaper. Holmes told her, with every appearance of confiding the results of his investigation in a spirit of transparent honesty, that he now believed the forgery had been executed using documents obtained from a particular London legal stationer, whose records dated the purchase to a specific quarter of the year. Miss Harbury listened with attention, asked 2 or 3 questions of a general nature, and expressed at the end a quiet gratitude that the matter was advancing towards clarity. She did not correct him, and her demeanour throughout was that of a person receiving information rather than assessing it against existing knowledge. Mallory was next, encountered in the billiard room where he had retreated with a copy of The Field and the distracted air of a man who has been pretending to read for some considerable time. To him, Holmes presented a version in which the forgery's key anachronism had apparently been introduced not through the drafter's inadvertent use of later legal language, but through the deliberate substitution of a single page within the original document, a detail which, Holmes implied, pointed towards a specific method of physical construction. Mallory received this with animated interest, asked whether that meant the original page still existed somewhere, and offered the further observation that it seemed a tremendous risk to take over a document that had never, to his knowledge, been seriously questioned. He did not correct the detail. He did, however, display a degree of energetic engagement that sat at some variance with the weary social ease of his previous manner, and Holmes, as he rejoined me in the corridor afterwards, noted it with a single raised eyebrow. "Interested," Holmes said, "but not correcting. He knows the general terrain without knowing the specific geography." Finch presented the most delicate challenge. Holmes found him in his customary place in the library, and I lingered near the doorway as before, my presence having by this stage acquired the comfortable invisibility of a familiar object. To Finch, Holmes presented a version in which the 2 witnesses whose signatures had been omitted from the charter had been persuaded to remain silent not through financial inducement, but through the deliberate destruction of a document that would otherwise have benefited them. A document recording a small bequest from Godfrey Harbury's personal estate, separate from the main inheritance. Finch heard this in his characteristic pose of consultative stillness, his spectacles low, his hands folded upon the ledger before him. When Holmes concluded, Finch was quiet for a moment, the long, considered pause that was native to him, and then said, with the measured care of a man selecting his words from a very limited supply, "I believe the bequest you describe was not destroyed, Mr. Holmes. It was suppressed. There is a difference in the record it leaves." Holmes thanked him pleasantly and withdrew. In the corridor he said nothing to me, but his step had acquired a fractional lightness that told me everything the words withheld. Mrs. Dalrymple was last. Holmes sought her in the linen room on the upper floor, where she was engaged in the kind of domestic administration that large houses generate ceaselessly, and which, I suspected, she had found useful throughout the past several days as a means of maintaining the appearance of ordinary occupation. The version he presented to her described the forgery's most critical alteration, the deletion of the 2 witness signatures, as having been accomplished by the substitution of an entirely new final page, the original having been removed and replaced with a facsimile, on which the unwanted names simply did not appear. It was a plausible method, and for a person with no direct knowledge, it would have been as acceptable as any other. Mrs. Dalrymple set down the linen she had been folding with a deliberateness that was not quite the deliberateness of an untroubled woman continuing an interrupted task. "The last page was not substituted," she said. Her voice was level, and her eyes, meeting Holmes's with the directness that had characterized her from the beginning, held in them something that was beyond wariness, something older and more exhausted, the look of a person who has been maintaining a position for so long that the original reasons for maintaining it have become abstract. The names were removed from the existing page. The parchment was treated and the ink lifted. It was a considerable piece of work. It took the better part of 2 days. Holmes regarded her for a moment with an attention that contained, I thought, a quality of recognition, as though the confirmation of what he had suspected brought not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of solemn acknowledgement. "You were present when it was done," he said. It was not a question. "I was present," she said. Nothing more. Holmes thanked her, and we descended the stairs in a silence that lasted until we had reached the hallway, where Lestrade was waiting with his notebook and the expectant expression of a man who has been patient long enough. "Well?" he said. Holmes removed his coat, draped it over the hall stand, and turned to face us both with the collected composure of a man who has completed the preparatory work and is now ready to begin the final construction. Finch possessed indirect knowledge. He had found evidence in the records of what had occurred, but had not witnessed it directly. Mallory knows the broad outline of the original deception, but not its mechanical detail. Miss Harbury knows nothing of the forgery's execution. And Mrs. Dalrymple, he said, was standing in the room while the parchment was treated and the names were lifted from it. She watched it happen. She may, I think, have assisted. He was quiet for a moment. What none of them has yet told us, however, is who held the knife. Lestrade looked up from his notebook. The penknife, the ink residue. The penknife, Holmes confirmed, and a great deal more besides. The person who directed this enterprise 30 years ago had legal knowledge, physical access to the documents, and sufficient authority over a young domestic clerk to ensure her silence for 3 decades. That person, he said, with the finality of a problem resolved, I am now in a position to name. Tomorrow evening, I should like everyone assembled in the drawing room. I will require one further piece of confirmation in the morning, and then I believe we may bring this matter at last to its conclusion. Chapter 9. The Past Unveiled. The confirmation Holmes required came before breakfast. He had risen at some hour I did not witness and returned from Whitchurch by 8 o'clock with a single sheet of paper folded in his breast pocket and an expression of that particular settledness which descends upon him when the last piece of a construction falls into place and the whole reveals itself as he had expected it to be. He said nothing of what the paper contained until Lestrade had joined us in the small morning room and the door was closed. Then he drew it out, unfolded it upon the table, and presented it to us without preamble. It was a transcript made by the registrar's clerk at Lestrade's earlier request of the professional record of one Mr. Gerald Mallory, father of the present Cedric Mallory, who had practised as a solicitor in Hampshire and London between the years 1852 and 1881. Among the offices he had held was that of junior legal adviser to the Harbury estate from 1858 until 1870, a period which encompassed entirely the death of Godfrey Harbury, the informal transition of the estate to Sir Julian, and the subsequent years during which the forged charter had been prepared and executed. His name did not appear in the original settlement document Carver had produced. It appeared, Holmes had determined through an examination of the estate's retained correspondence, accessible through the plan chest, which Finch had made available after a private conversation Holmes had conducted with him that same morning, as the signatory on no fewer than 7 letters to Sir Julian between 1863 and 1867, each concerning the legal formalisation of the estate's governance. Gerald Mallory had drafted the charter. Gerald Mallory had held the penknife. Lestrade absorbed this with the steadiness of a man who has learned not to express surprise in the presence of Holmes until he has confirmed that surprise is warranted. "The father," he said, "not the son. The father executed the forgery, the son inherited its consequences." Holmes folded the paper and restored it to his pocket. "Cedric Mallory has visited Harbury House regularly for 20 years, maintaining what he describes as a friendship formed through Sir Julian. That friendship, I suggest, rested upon a foundation considerably less sentimental than he has represented. Sir Julian knew what Gerald Mallory had done for him. Cedric, upon his father's death, inherited both a knowledge of that service and the leverage it provided. Leverage he has applied, gently and persistently, in the form of those visits, those social courtesies, and those very considerable debts which he has somehow contrived never to be pressed upon." "He was extracting payment," I said. "Not through direct extortion, but through the perpetual hospitality of a man who dared not refuse him. And after Sir Julian's death, through the continued tolerance of whoever managed the estate. Which means Miss Harbury, knowingly or not, has been maintaining this arrangement without understanding its full basis." Holmes rose from the table. "Tonight, Watson. The drawing-room at 8. I will not pretend that the hours between that morning conversation and the appointed evening were comfortable ones. The house had taken on the particular quality of a place in which something irrevocable is approaching, in which the ordinary rhythms of domestic life continue because they must, while beneath them the ground has already shifted. Mrs. Dalrymple served luncheon with her customary precision. Finch did not emerge from the library. Mallory appeared at mid-afternoon, applied himself to the decanter in the drawing-room with a concentration that suggested the morning had not been an easy one for him, and retired again to change for dinner with the careful movements of a man managing a considerable internal weather. At 8 o'clock precisely, Holmes assembled the household. They came in separately and arranged themselves about the drawing-room with the instinctive spatial awareness of people who each prefer to remain close to a point of exit. Miss Harbury took the chair nearest the fireplace. Finch settled at the periphery, near the shelved volumes, with the expression of a man who has decided to witness what he cannot prevent. Mallory stood at the mantelpiece, with a glass he did not drink from. Mrs. Dalrymple alone remained standing near the door, and it was she upon whom Holmes's attention settled first when he took his position before the fireplace, with the composed authority of a man who has earned the floor. "I am going to tell you what occurred 30 years ago," he said, without any preliminary. "I shall be as brief as the facts allow. I should be grateful if you would each refrain from interruption until I have concluded." The room was silent. Holmes laid it out with the clean, unsparing economy that was, in such moments, his most formidable quality. Godfrey Harbury had died intestate, his affairs in disorder, leaving his estate to pass by informal agreement to his younger brother Julian. Gerald Mallory, as the family's legal adviser, had managed that transition. In doing so, he had discovered, Holmes did not speculate as to the precise circumstances of discovery, contenting himself with its consequences, that Godfrey had made, some years before his death, an informal but legally recoverable undertaking to a third party, whose claim upon a portion of the estate was not without merit. Rather than acknowledge that claim, and thereby diminish both the inheritance and his own professional standing, Gerald Mallory had fabricated a charter of formal succession, predating it to the period of Godfrey's death, and constructing it with sufficient technical skill to withstand ordinary scrutiny. To execute this, he had required assistance. Mrs. Dalrymple, then Eleanor Marsh, a clerk engaged for administrative work, had been present throughout the document's preparation, had handled the parchment, had been instructed in the technique of lifting ink from treated vellum, and had observed the removal of the two witnesses' signatures. She had been kept silent through a combination of dependency, loyalty to those who employed her, and the gradual accumulation of years which make old actions feel increasingly remote and increasingly permanent. Holmes paused here, not for effect, but because what followed required a different register. Alastair Pembroke, he continued, had served as custodian of the Harbury estate for 20 years. He had no direct knowledge of the forgery's execution, but he was a man of intelligence and professional conscience, and over time he had arrived at suspicions he had chosen not to examine. When the anonymous letters came, written, I believe, by the descendant of the third party whose claim Gerald Mallory had suppressed, acting upon family knowledge passed down across the years, Pembroke could no longer sustain that avoidance. He came to this house to review the charter in its physical form, and to speak with those who knew what he had begun to understand. He intended to make a full disclosure. He had written 3 words of the document that would have initiated it. Mrs. Dalrymple had not moved. Her eyes were fixed upon Holmes with an attention so complete it had the quality of stillness before a break. "He confronted you," Holmes said directly to her. "That evening, after the household retired, he came to you because you were the person he believed most likely to confirm what he already knew, and because he trusted, I think, that you had your own desire to see the matter resolved. You gave him the brandy from the decanter in the library passage. You had introduced into it a compound obtainable from the estate's own medicinal stores, a preparation of sufficient concentration to act within the hour upon a man of Pembroke's age and constitution. Then you returned to his study while he was insensible, altered the witness sections of the charter to further obscure the record, burned the letter from the claimant's descendant that Pembroke had brought with him, and were back in your own quarters before the house stirred." He produced, from his inner pocket, the notebook from the library. "Mr. Finch has maintained, for his own protection, a record of what he discovered in the estate documents over 15 years of archival work. It is a precise, methodical, and entirely damning account." He set it on the table. "It corroborates every element of what I have described." Mrs. Dalrymple looked at Finch. The archivist met her gaze without apology and without satisfaction, the gaze of a man who is deeply tired and has been so for a very long time. "It was not to protect myself," she said. Her voice had lost, for the first time, its long-maintained steadiness. "Pembroke would have ruined Miss Eleanor. Everything Sir Julian built, everything he left her, it would all have been torn down. The claim, the courts, the years of litigation. She had nothing to do with any of it." Miss Harbury spoke then, quietly and from the fireside, without looking up. "I would have borne it," she said. The silence that followed that exchange was one of the most complete I have ever sat within. Holmes said nothing to fill it, and in this, I thought, he showed his truest quality. Not the relentless forward motion of the investigation, but a steady, respectful acknowledgement that some moments belong to those who have lived inside them, and not to those who have merely illuminated them from outside. It was Lestrade who broke it, with the necessary formality of his office, and Mrs. Dalrymple who received his words with her chin raised, and her hands, for the first time since I had known her, folded quietly in her lap, rather than occupied with the endless, disciplined business of a long and burdened life. Chapter 10. The Weight of Years. They took Mrs. Dalrymple away the following morning. Lestrade had arranged for a police conveyance from Whitchurch, and it arrived at 9:30 with a quietness of manner, on Lestrade's specific instruction, I suspected, that spared the household the additional indignity of spectacle. She came down the main staircase dressed with the same unhurried care she had brought to every morning of her service at Harbury House, a small travelling case in one hand, and she paused at the foot of the stairs and looked back along the hall with an expression that contained within it the particular anguish of a person taking leave of a place that has been, whatever else, the fixed point about which 30 years of daily existence have arranged themselves. Miss Harbury stood in the doorway of the drawing-room. She said nothing. Neither did Mrs. Dalrymple. There passed between them, in the silence of that wide entrance hall, something that required no articulation and would not have been improved by any. A recognition, I thought, of a relationship made irreparably strange by the truth that had emerged from it, but not, even now, entirely divested of its long-accumulated human weight. Then the door closed, the wheels of the conveyance turned upon the gravel, and it was over. Holmes and I departed Harbury House that afternoon. Finch had returned to his library with, I imagined, a sense of relief so profound as to be almost physical. The relief of a man who has kept a document locked in a drawer for 15 years and has finally been permitted to hand it to its proper authority. Mallory had left the previous evening after a private conversation with Lestrade, of which Holmes spoke only to say that Cedric Mallory's years of extracted hospitality were unlikely to continue, and that the precise legal consequences of his position were a matter for the courts and for the profession whose standards his father had so comprehensively violated. Miss Harbury saw us to the door herself. She shook Holmes's hand with a directness that matched the directness she had shown from the beginning, and she thanked him in terms that were brief, genuine, and entirely without the excessive sentiment that a weaker character might have permitted the occasion. "The estate," she said. "I intend to make inquiries regarding the original claimant's descendants. Whatever their entitlement amounts to in law, I mean to understand it clearly and address it honestly." Holmes regarded her for a moment with an expression that I can only describe as one of quiet approval, rare with him, and the more valuable for its rarity. "The Charter's legal standing is a question for other minds than mine," he said, "but the resolve you describe is one that I find, Miss Harbury, rather more admirable than any document." She inclined her head and turned back into the house, and we walked to the waiting trap, with the cedar's long shadow falling once more across the frost-stiffened lawn, pointing eastward in the thin November light. The train back to London carried us through a countryside that had advanced, in the days since our arrival, further into the stripped severity of late autumn, the trees at their most skeletal against a sky of pale and fading grey. Holmes sat opposite me in the carriage with his legs crossed and his coat collar turned up, looking out at the passing fields with an abstraction that I had learned to distinguish from mere inattention. It was the abstraction of a mind that has discharged its immediate obligation, and now, in the interval before the next, turns its attention inward, not to rest exactly, but to absorb. We did not speak for some miles. When Holmes did speak, it was without preamble, as though continuing a conversation already half completed in his own thoughts. "The anonymous letters were sent by a Mr. Thomas Reeve," he said, "second son of a woman named Catherine Reeve, born Catherine Harbury, who was an illegitimate daughter of Godfrey Harbury, acknowledged privately by him but never formally. The undertaking Godfrey made, the one Gerald Mallory suppressed, was a financial provision for her and her children. It was modest in absolute terms, but its legal basis was recoverable. Thomas Reeve is a schoolmaster in Devonshire who has spent 12 years attempting to have the matter examined through legitimate channels without success. The anonymous letters were his final expedient before abandoning the effort entirely. I considered this. Then the wrong was real. The suppressed claim was genuine. Entirely genuine. Godfrey Harbury was, by all accounts, a man of more natural decency than his brother, which perhaps explains why Sir Julian found it desirable to manage his legacy so comprehensively. Holmes turned from the window. 3 decades of a family's security built upon the deliberate effacement of a woman and her children. The architecture was elegant, Watson. It is only when you examine the foundation that the nature of the materials becomes apparent. "And Mrs. Dalrymple," I said after a moment, "do you think she fully understood, at the time, what she was participating in?" Holmes was quiet for a while. Outside, a small village slid past. A church, a green, a dozen houses arranged with the settled permanence of a community that has stood long enough to forget that it was ever otherwise. "She was 22 years old," he said at last. "She was in a subordinate position, in a dependent circumstance, and she was directed by a man of authority and professional standing. That she understood the action to be irregular is certain. One does not spend 2 days lifting ink from vellum without understanding that something is being concealed. That she understood its full human consequence at the time, I am less sure." He paused. "What is certain is that she understood it entirely by the time she was 50, and that she chose, at each of those intervening years, to remain silent. The young woman's confusion is comprehensible. The older woman's repeated election of silence is rather harder to excuse. He turned back to the window. And the act against Pembroke is of course beyond excuse entirely, whatever the motivation she claimed for it. Misplaced protectiveness has sent as many people to their ruin as deliberate malice, and the law, quite correctly, makes no distinction between them. We reached London as the lamps were being lit along the embankment, the city reasserting itself after the open country, with its particular brand of indifferent energy, the streets full of the evening's traffic, the air thick with coal smoke and the smell of the river. Baker Street received us as it always does, with the comfortable and entirely unceremonious constancy of a place that does not require you to explain where you have been. Mrs. Hudson brought supper without being asked, set it before the fire with the quiet satisfaction of a woman restoring proper order to a household that has been absent too long, and withdrew. Holmes ate in silence, then settled in his chair and stretched his legs towards the grate with a long and almost inaudible exhalation that was, for him, the equivalent of a considerable unburdening. I wrote up my notes at the desk by the window while the fire burned down, the sounds of Baker Street rising and fading in the familiar way below. At some point, Holmes spoke, not turning from the fire, his voice carrying the reflective quietness of a man thinking aloud rather than addressing a companion. 30 years, Watson, he said. A young woman makes a choice she does not fully understand, and for 30 years it shapes the entire architecture of her existence, whom she serves, where she lives, what she may not say aloud, who she becomes. The action was one afternoon's work, the consequence was a lifetime. He was still for a moment. The past is never truly past, it merely awaits the moment of its return. I set down my pen and looked at him, at the sharp profile, the firelight on the angular face, the stillness that was never quite stillness, because the mind behind it was never entirely at rest. I had known this man for many years, had followed him into cellars and across moorlands, and into rooms where darkness of every variety waited, and I had written of his methods and his brilliance, and his occasional maddening opacity. But what I found myself thinking, in that quiet Baker Street evening, was something simpler than any of those things. He cared. Beneath the apparatus of method and the brisk impatience with the commonplace, he cared with a constancy and depth that his manner was designed, I had long suspected, to protect rather than to deny. The victims of the cases he took, the wronged, the suppressed, the silenced, were not to him merely the occasions for intellectual exercise. They were the reason. I did not say so. Holmes would have found it acutely embarrassing, and I had learned, across our long association, to preserve the truths between us that were better understood than spoken. I simply returned to my notes and the fire burned on, and outside the window London moved through its vast indifferent evening, and in the room above Baker Street, 2 men sat in the comfortable silence of those who have done what needed doing and are not yet required to do anything more.